we have, as I traveled the country as a presidential candidate in 2004, and as I expected here in 2008, this issue of election integrity is right up there with peace and health care and all the concerns that Americans have. So what I would ask you is help us build a format for hearings on election integrity. Help us examine the issues that we know are out there and put them in the public record, in the congressional record, in the hearing record, so that we can create some new directions. But we need to heighten public awareness. And I'm ready to work with you in going over all those issues, whether it's in Ohio or Florida or some of the other areas. I mean, look what happened in Florida in the very district of the former Secretary of State. How people didn't have the ability to vote. I mean, this is a defining issue about whether or not the election's legitimate. And so I'm aware of that, and I want to explore it. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I just want to thank you, Congressman, for coming down and expressing your views, supporting media reform in a very legitimate and strong way. But briefly, I just want to touch back on the impeachment issue that the gentleman brought up. I don't know what it is now. I know you said it's not really a politically viable time to perhaps bring up impeachment to the Bush administration. And I can sort of see the argument, but I guess for people who are really looking for some accountability to the Bush administration and all the different crimes that they've committed internationally and here in the United States, what do you suggest should be a method for holding the feet to the fire to the Bush administration? If we shouldn't impeach, what should Congress do?
I've said earlier that we need to safeguard our Constitution, that the President has now moved into the soft circumference of a measure of accountability that he may not be used to. And if he moves and takes another step towards another war, he may very well find himself facing an impeachment, not only an inquiry, but an active effort.
I find that constructive, but I mean, like, how many steps are we willing to let it take and happen? I mean, we can look at just militarily at what the president has done in Afghanistan, in Iraq, stuff that's happening in Somalia with all the deaths that happened just this past week. And I guess for someone who I respect their views on peace and anti-war, I really respect them. And I think that, like, when I was an undergrad in college, we really, really revered you. Stopped by University of Illinois, I think. And we were really, really respectful of what you had to say, and it really touched us a lot deeply. So I think to confront the Bush administration and stop them from what they're going to be doing tomorrow instead of a couple of months from now might be more constructive, in knowing that the lives that we would probably be saving here from our own sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, cousins, etc., and the people, our community members across the world. So what do you think we should do to legitimately stop the Bush administration, say, from impeaching?
Call members of Congress and tell them to vote against continued funding of the war. And that needs to be, that's a tangible thing. Now let me show you why it's important. Okay. In 1999, I sued the Clinton administration, along with, joined by people on both sides of the aisle, in challenging his war against Serbia and the bombing of Serbia. The reason why we didn't win is that the Washington District Court ruled that since Congress appropriated funds for the war, the Congress, in effect, had given implied consent. So the efforts to try to curtail the conduct of the war by Congress were essentially a nullity, because the funding of the war itself was tantamount to approval of the war. Now let's look now at the instant case with respect to Iraq. There are members of Congress who want to simultaneously maintain, and presidential candidates who want to maintain, that they are opposed to the war. Now let me give you a thumbnail sketch here. Without any animosity towards any of these people, because everybody's struggling with this in a different way. But the record shows that Hillary Clinton voted for authorization 14 of 14 times. She voted to fund the war. That John Kerry voted for authorization 14 of 14 times, voted to fund the war. That John Edwards voted for authorization 4 of 4 times when he was in the Senate, voted to fund the war. He has since said that he opposes the war, but what we need to hear is there a shift in worldview, and would he favor attacking some other nation? We need to know that. Barack Obama, 8 out of 8 votes to fund the war during his time in the Senate. He wasn't there for the authorization. He voted 8 out of 8 times to fund the war. So, right now, we need to make it known that we expect Congress to bring this administration to accountability on the war. And the only way that Congress can has the power of the purse. And as we do that, if the congressional leaders went to President tomorrow and said, Mr. President, there's money in the pipeline right now to bring the troops home. Or we're going to create a separate fund to bring the troops home. We're not going to appropriate funds to continue to prosecute the war, because the problem is if Congress goes ahead and appropriates up to $160 billion in supplemental funds to keep the war going, the war will continue through the end of President Bush's term. And so Congress, since there is a Democratic-controlled Congress now, we can't say, well, this is just President Bush's war, because Congress has a constitutional responsibility as a co-equal branch of government to act in the interest not only of the American people, but of the world community. So we go to the President and we say, we're not going to fund a continuation of war. The money's there to bring the troops home. Mr. President, set a peace process in place. Go to the world community, which is waiting for the United States to reemerge in a cooperative way, and ask for the UN to assist. The UN is the only international agency that has the legitimacy to authorize and the ability to mobilize troops. We need to go to the UN and get their help. We need to open up talks with Iran and Syria, not bomb them, but we need to talk to them and get their help so that we can stabilize Iraq. And when we get the international community participating, I'd like to see half of those troops come from Muslim nations so that we could see some simpatico, and then we take steps to put a peace process in place. Now this can happen, but it cannot happen if Congress votes for the supplemental. And so that's why I have made this a defining issue. This is an issue in a presidential race. It's a huge issue. Think about this. The presidency of the United States assumes that the person who is being given this awesome responsibility of managing this tremendous power has the judgment and the foresight to be able to guide the affairs of the nation. Almost every other candidate who's out there not only voted for the war, but spoke in favor of it, or voted to fund it. So, you know, I'm standing actually in a singular position for having demonstrated the foresight and the awareness, for having called it for what it was, and for continuing to offer a new path. So the people are going to really be given a chance. Do they want a new direction? Or is it going to be the continuation of the empire? And so this is why your work in demanding that Congress stop the funding is urgent. Today's news, congressional leaders have said, oh, they're opposed to the surge, but they're going to continue funding the war. We cannot permit that to happen. Yes,
Mr. Kucinich, isn't the sending of a second aircraft carrier into the Persian Gulf region a provocation which may, in effect, cause us to be attacked, thereby short-circuiting your...
Well, listen, the president is clearly trying to provoke Iran. I mean, the raid on the offices in the Kurdish area and the arrest of 5 people connected with the government of Iran was a provocation. The sending of a carrier out to the region, another carrier, is a provocation. The putting of troops inside the Iranian border and then bringing them back out, a provocation. The selecting of bombing targets and letting it be known worldwide is a provocation. The moving of Patriot missiles into the region, a provocation. The building of moving nuclear bunker busters into the region and putting broadcasting out there that, you know, Iran's next, a provocation. So this administration, as it moves in that direction, is treading, I believe, on the thinnest ice they've ever been on. And it's not just, you know, I'm speaking as a Democrat, but there are many Republicans who are concerned about this too. So what you want to happen is you want unity in the Congress on this kind of a question. And he is creating a type of unity that hasn't existed in the Congress. And so you want Congress to move together. And you don't want to fracture the possibility of a bipartisan coalition, which I think we're moving towards, particularly in watching what this administration said about Iran and watching what they're doing with respect to Iran. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask you about a domestic policy question, specifically federal funding of faith-based programs. My readers are among the 1 in 10 Americans who call themselves secularists, atheists, agnostics, skeptics. One of their primary values is that any government program has to be open to everyone. As the chair of this subcommittee, what can you do to review and possibly roll back programs that have discrimination and exclusivity built into them?
In both our subcommittee and in the full committee on the education committee, which I'm also a member of, by the way, I have voted against initiatives for funding faith-based groups. I think freedom of religion is an awesome matter, and I think that that we need to be careful to distinguish between establishing a religion on one hand, which I think any funding runs into that establishment clause, and recognizing the spiritual impulse which exists in people of all faiths and even people of no faith. And so I think that separation of church and state was never meant to rule out an appreciation for something transcendent. And so, but at the same time, I believe, as you do, that there should not be government funds given for the purposes of supporting these faith-based operations. The truth of the matter is, though, many churches right now are supporting the hungry people. Our government isn't doing that anymore. Many churches are helping visit the elderly and provide them with support. Our government doesn't do that anymore. Many churches are feeding the elderly. Our government doesn't do that anymore. The churches have taken up an obligation that government has basically abandoned. So we have to be sensitive to that, and I think one way is you incentivize tax laws with respect to foundations, where you can, have the foundations provide an opportunity to fund some of these operations. But more than that, the government needs to resume its role in caring for people, in feeding the hungry, in clothing the naked, in sheltering the homeless. I mean, that is actually, covered in Matthew 25. Whatever you do for the least of the brethren. I mean, this is a Christian principle, and I don't see that being adverse to the assertion of the imperative of separation of church and state. So this is something that we can move towards without setting ourselves in opposition to people of faith, but to set ourselves to include the imperative of the Constitution and separation of church and state, where we can actually celebrate religion and keep it out of the government. Yes.
Sir. Oh, okay. Senator Feingold tried censuring and didn't get anywhere with censuring, so I don't know why they're so adamant about thinking that impeachment would work when they couldn't even censure. Couldn't get no help.
Think from the time that Senator Feingold, who's a friend of mine, made that suggestion, things have changed dramatically. There's a greater awareness on the part of members of Congress and how bankrupt the president's policies are, and among Republicans as well. I have to tell you, there's a vast change among Republicans. You can just hear it on the floor of the House. You can hear it in the elevator chatter. Republicans are saying this guy, Republicans feel, and rightly so, that Bush cost them control of the House of Representatives. Now think about this for a moment. They know that the Democrats won back the House on the issue of Iraq. Unfortunately, some Democratic leaders want to basically go to the Democratic leadership default position, which is take the war off the table. We cannot permit that to happen. So I think that we are seeing a coalescing occurring, and I'd like to see that process continue. There's time for this president to be held accountable, and not just the president. When we say the president, let's incorporate the vice president, because really, he participated in all these decisions, and he needs to be similarly held to account. So we're at the threshold of enormous changes in this country. We just buried a president who saw the need to try to heal the country, even though he gave President Nixon get out of jail free card. He's given credit with healing the country because people realized what an impeachment would have meant at that time. However, I'll go back to talking about Iran. Everything could change with Iran. Now, it doesn't mean he shouldn't be held accountable for Iraq. Of course he should. And I think that's going to happen too. He's going to be held accountable. But I don't want to have anything that I say here be construed that I've asked for the president to be impeached, because if I do that, it changes everything that I have to say. This major media that you're talking about, that this is the subject of this weekend, they wouldn't talk about anything else but impeachment. You want to get a message out about something, it would all get swamped. There would be nothing else to talk about. Now, if the country goes to that point because there's a consensus in the Congress, so be it. But I don't think we're there just yet. But the president may be helping it along. Okay, who's had their hand up like forever?
Me.
Yes.
Me.
I appreciate that any president needs to be able to operate within a certain amount of secrecy. What
do you think is an appropriate amount of secrecy?
Why? I mean,
Okay.
you know, this idea of secrecy, let's look at this. Let there be light. Let there be light that spreads itself across all the workings of government. Let there be light and transparency, so that every government policy is subject to review, so that every person knows exactly what the workings of a government is. You know, we cannot be in a position where the government is a secret unto itself. You know, the idea of a democracy is anathema to secrecy. Secrecy is part of fascism, it's part of totalitarianism, it's not been democratic. So we have to work to renew transparency so we know the decisions that are being made. And that's really Congress's a very serious responsibility here. We have to challenge secrecy in government. Secrecy is opposed to democracy. Yes, sir.
I've been covering the Vern Buchanan, Christine Jennings race very, very carefully through every single step, videotaping the testing of the equipment and so forth, as well as in Pinellas County. And I covered the trial for the source code hearing. And I'm convinced, and the evidence speaks for itself as far as the statistical analysis of the machines that were prepared before October 18th, undervoted at a rate of around 11%. The machines that were prepared for the election after October 18th, undervoted at a rate of 17%. There's no way that would happen unless there was different code or the code was altered at that date, because the machines where they're delivered is uniformly random. The only explanation is the code cheated, essentially, and somebody placed the wrong code in there. Susan Pinchon of, I believe, Vote Trust requested the video records from a Sunshine Act information request. They waited 3 weeks, and then they said, "Oh, we're sorry, those records have been erased now." There's other evidence as well. Can Congress have their own investigation, have their own, essentially, police or representatives lock down that warehouse, grab those servers, grab the source code, and seize the machines and find out what really happened?
I told you before that I want to proceed with hearings on election integrity. And the case that you just outlined is an object lesson in the urgency of Congress addressing this issue. I mean, I'm willing to do this. Christine Jennings appeared before the Democratic Caucus the other day to share her experience, and there is a great concern about how these elections are being. We first need to build the context of the urgency of it by going over every example, or at least the most glaring examples, that have been documented. So if you've got documentation, we can move forward. If documentation has been destroyed, our committee has subpoena power. So, you know, I'm
But we need to grab what's left before they cover their tracks completely.
DJ Kucinich at Gmail, send me some information, and I'll prepare a discussion with the committee staff to let them know that I feel that this is something that we should move on quickly.
Can I bring up one small point? jeanniedean.livejournal.com has all the information. She's been following the whole
If you could
instance.
send me an email and link to it, okay? Because
Absolutely, I will. I'm just for everybody else's benefit.
Okay,
Thank
here's
you.
what I'm going to ask to do. Everyone who's had their hand up, keep their hand up. If you haven't raised your hand, don't, you know, I'm going to have to wrap this up in a minute. But I want to ask the questions of those who consistently had their hands up. Yes.
Quick question about the Aaron Watata case.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the restrictions on political speech and what elected officials?
Well, I met with Aaron Watata's parents in Hawaii, and I've been in touch with them. And I think that there are members of the armed services who have shown great courage in questioning the war. As a matter of fact, on Tuesday in Washington, D.C. at 11 o'clock, I'm going to be presented with a petition for redress signed by 1,000 members of the armed services, challenging the policies and how troops are treated and the mission and all those things. This is almost, almost unprecedented. It may be unprecedented. I'm going to take those petitions. I'll write a letter to the Speaker, ask her to receive them. She will then refer them to the Committee of Jurisdiction, and hopefully we'll get some hearings on this very point. The canard, support the troops,
Yeah.
needs to be challenged in a ringing and declarative way. We are not supporting the troops by sending them off to a war that's based on lies. We're not supporting the troops by putting them in a situation where they don't have the equipment they need. We're not supporting the troops by sending them in a situation with people, which experts say cannot be won militarily. We're not supporting the troops when they don't have the vests that they need, when they don't have sufficient force to help them, when we're sending them door to door to in Baghdad, where there's in the middle of a civil war. That's a pretty poor regard for the troops. Support for the troops is consistent with listening to what the troops have to say. We talked about restoring our Constitution here. You know, the First Amendment. I mean, we have a right to petition our government. And if somebody's defending those rights, how much more of an obligation do we have to receive those petitions and give those individuals an expression of constitutional protection, just as we're saying that they're trying to protect the rights of the people of Iraq? I mean, so yes, we need to open up the process and hear from the soldiers. I mean, my wife was was traveling to from Nashville to Memphis on a Greyhound. Had the opportunity at a Greyhound station to talk to some of the young people we're serving. And when you talk to people who've been over there, there's a lot of horror stories about what people go through. When you look at the kind of psychological damage our troops are experiencing, I mean, you know, so we know about what the Iraqi people are experiencing, 650,000 excess deaths, cries out for justice. Our troops are being sent into conditions that are impossible. And many of them are very young people. I'm looking at this room, but imagine yourself, 18, 19 years old, sent into the middle of a civil war, people shooting at you from all sides. Everybody who's there is potentially an enemy. And the only person you have to regard is your buddy next to you. We're asking our troops to do things that are impossible. So we need to open up and receive them. And that's what I'm doing. I'm flying back to Washington early on Tuesday morning, and you can watch that. You know, we'll try to put something on our website about the petition for redress. People need to know about it. Thank you. Next.